Jake Hager, who is officially retired from the wrestling business, I shall light a candle tonight in memory, sat down for an interview with Chris Van Vliet that was posted this week talking about his career in WWE and AEW. Among the things that he mentioned, he was outright told, he claims, by someone in WWE at the time that John Cena refused to lose to him when he had his Money in the Bank contract to cash in, which is why he ended up beating Chris Jericho instead to win the world title on SmackDown. He also once pitched an idea that Tony Khan rejected when he was doing the purple hat gimmick, where he would basically turn into Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy. But instead of saying, "I am Groot," he would say, "I like this hat." And everybody in the Jericho Appreciation Society would know what he was saying when he said it. Which is why it's not always a good thing to let the talent have creative input. There's Exhibit A. He also said that he now runs his own trucking company called Hall & Oates. Now, I know he's not the only one using that name for their business, but he earns points with me just for being a Hall & Oates fan. I'll give him points for that. But what made headlines here were his comments about his time in AEW, which came to an end last year when they allowed his contract to expire. He said he's very jaded from his time in AEW, and he wishes that he would have just stayed doing MMA, where he was undefeated in 4 fights, 3 wins and 1 no contest. But he says that he felt disrespected after being offered an 18-month deal to stay with the company, which I believe he said he did sign, but he felt like it was a sign that Tony Khan really didn't want him there. He said, "The negotiation process was very one-way, and I could tell that, well, anyways, I always find a way to say this every day, so I think everybody should too, say, fuck Tony Khan." I could tell that he didn't want me there. He offered me like a year and a half. I was like, bro, I just did Stadium Stampede twice. Don't act like Stadium Stampede didn't put AEW on the map. I was in the debut episode. I was the big spoiler. And you offer me 18 months after all that? So it was at that point and the way that he started running the business that it really, like, he wasn't a professional. I said it the exact way he just said it. He wasn't a professional because he only offered Jake Hager a 1.5-year deal. Really. Of all the things that you could say Tony Khan, that he's not a professional, and here's why, that's why he's not a professional. Because you thought that your worth was more than it really was, and that he only offered you a 1.5 years. He claimed that after all of the Punk shit went down, there was a meeting that was just between the wrestlers. Veterans like Sting, Paul White, Chris Jericho, Bryan Danielson, and Jon Moxley were talking through the situation when Tony Khan stormed into the room. Lo and behold, he said, who comes into the room storming in? Daddy's little billionaire. And he's yelling at us because I think it was Dax Harwood and Cash Wheeler didn't want to come in. They didn't like the storyline, so they refused to come to TV that day. And he was like, listen, I'll put you in a 6-man 6 minutes before the show and you're going to do it. And we're all just like feeling disrespected. And I still to this day wish I would have stood up and said, you know, a lot of things, but like, you just told Sting that you're going to put him in a 6-man and 6 minutes, but then you're going to honor him for his retirement. We all became his little playthings. I do remember it being reported there was a talent meeting at the time led by Moxley, Jericho, and Danielson, but this is the first I'm hearing of Tony Khan storming into the room like that. I would actually be impressed if he put his foot down like that. And so maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But the entire story is called into question when FTR responded, since their names were mentioned. First, with Dax Harwood refuting Hager's claim, saying, Cash and I were at the all-talent only meeting that was called by Bryan, Jericho, and Mox. Tony never interrupted. Cash and I have never refused to show up to work, and I dare say if you look at our schedule since Collision started, we're the most consistent talent that make both shows every week. I'm not really sure where all of this is coming from, but it is mostly not true. Cash Wheeler then responded, and he never responds to shit like this on social media. It's always Dax. Dax is always the one who's up in his feelings about something. So for Wheeler to respond, you know it must be serious. Not only did he respond to Hager's claims, but he brought the receipts as well. He shared a DM exchange with Hager where Hager said, I apologize if you're upset. I said, I think it was you two. Didn't say it definitely was, but that meeting happened. To which Wheeler replied, I know, but to say that I think and then to actually say our names makes us look like assholes, and it wasn't even us. We're assholes, but we show up for work. And Hager replied, I apologize. I should not have said your names, especially when I didn't know for sure. So at least he apologized. But then later, he must have been upset that Cash went public with that screenshot because he tweeted, the meeting happened. FTR was not there. They can't deny the story no matter how many text messages they post. Meanwhile, the story wasn't even about them. Yes, the story wasn't about them, but you're the one who brought up their names. I would be upset too. He doesn't really seem to understand that. In the end, who really gives a shit? He's talking about a meeting that happened 3 years ago. But he had more to say about Tony, saying he was good with starting storylines, but could never follow through with them. He said you couldn't tell him anything. He couldn't take criticism. He was fucking up, and we were all just having to deal with it. You know, like we all had blood, sweat, and tears put into that company. We were all there at the beginning. Like we had our careers behind us that helped build that company. And then we all had to just sit side by side and couldn't do anything because he wanted to run it the way that he wanted to run it. I mean, it's almost like it's his company. That's the way it goes. Same with Vince McMahon for all those years. It was his company and nobody could tell him to do things that he didn't want to do, no matter how many talents or fans said they wanted him out of there. It was his company. That's why the product was in the shitter for so long. That's why we got the dark days of Raw back in 2018 and 2019. Now, I'm not saying Hager is wrong, that people there didn't have a right to be upset or frustrated by that, but AEW is Tony's little play toy. That's what it is. He runs it like his own personal e-fed. It's always been that way. And there have been stories that were started, storylines, but then never had a resolution, or they did, but they weren't very good. I mean, some of that may be due to injuries and other factors like the Devil stuff, you know, with MJF and Adam Cole. That was a major storyline that just got completely derailed. But then you have someone like Daniel Garcia a few years ago when they were teasing a split with him and Jericho. And it looked like maybe he was going to be the one to take the Ring of Honor world title from Jericho and then kind of branch off on his own. Only it ended up being a dumb swerve. And a terrible one at that. The Acclaimed. Remember when they got thrown through a plate glass window by a bunch of masked guys, which turned out to be the Undisputed Kingdom? And then they never got their revenge after they were off television for I don't know how long they were off TV for, weeks, months. Never bothered to get their revenge on the guys that threw them through that window. I know if somebody threw me through a glass window and put me on the shelf, I'd want to get revenge. Evidently, they didn't feel the same way. Britt Baker and Serena Deeb. Just this year, they started a storyline with Jeff Jarrett going after the world title that was so poorly received that Tony at least had enough sense to drop the entire thing. That was a good thing. That's an example of a storyline being started and then stopped. That was actually a good thing. But yes, you can absolutely find examples of Tony Khan doing this. Hager is not wrong about that. He also admitted that Tony did pay him well while he was there. So that's definitely not something that he was complaining about. Here's the deal with Jake Hager. Big guy, good wrestler. He was never over in AEW. His hat was over, okay? Don't mistake it for Jake Hager being over. His fucking hat was over. He had the personality of a coffee mug. Like, if you put a little purple hat on a coffee mug and drew a face on it, it would be just as over, if not more so, than Jake Hager was. I wouldn't be surprised if Tony Khan didn't like him and just didn't want him there. I mean, that's basically what he was saying. Chris Jericho is the one who got Hager his job in AEW in the first place. Tony hired him as a favor to Chris Jericho. And the first thing that they did was put Hager with Jericho when he debuted on that first Dynamite, right? They put him in the inner circle. It's the same reason why I've been saying that Killer Kross should not go to AEW, because Tony, if Tony would even take him, Kross shouldn't go there. It's not a good fit for him. He would not know what to do with him. Kross would end up working matches on Collision against Big Bill, another big guy that Tony doesn't seem to know what to do with. Tony doesn't know how to book these physically bigger guys from WWE, for the most part. You know, Bobby Lashley is one of the few exceptions. But those aren't the types of wrestlers that Tony likes. You could tell. You could tell what he likes if you just watch the product. Kross does not fit that, and neither did Hager. You know, he was lucky enough to have a friend work there who had some clout, and that got him gainfully employed, making, as he admitted, really good money for 5 years. You know what? That's nothing to be bitter about. Hager was simply out of touch with what Tony Khan was looking for. Now he gets to go be a family man to his 2 kids. His kiss was not on Tony's list. He lost that love and feeling. All right, that's enough. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. I still love the Hall & Oates thing, though. It's a great name for a trucking company.